Welcome back to Engine Shop Joe. I wanted to put this quick video up. Someone had asked me about test tooling or a test tool kit for checking the engine. Basically, I'm guessing the fuel system out. And so our basic kit at work that we send to our branches, our cost is $1,000, but it's got a lot of stuff that the average person wouldn't use. So I've kind of put together a very compact kit here. Not something I'm selling, but I'm going to point you to the places where you can buy the stuff. And this is what it's going to consist of. A pressure gauge that's between 0 and 400 psi. That way you can check your fuel pressure on the engine to see if you've got a plug fuel filter on the engine, because pressure side fuel filters, remember, will have drop. And you'll be able to check all the ISX family from the 870, actually the 570, all the way through the 2450, the low pressure side of the fuel system. And on the 871, that pressure in your IFSM can be at 320 psi. So your gauge had to go up that high, and then on your X2250 and 23 and 2450, you're looking at about 185 psi. And then you'll even be able to check the Bs, and down on the B67, where you're down around 85 psi, it'll be able to cover all those. So that's one thing. Then the second gauge is going to be a 0 to 30 vacuum combination gauge, 0 to 60 psi. And that way you'd be able to check not only your fuel filter restriction, but you'd be able to check electric lift pump pressure. So with a 0 to 400 pound gauge, you might not see the needle even move if you've only got 10 pounds of lift pump pressure at key on. But with the 0 to 60, you can turn the key on and check that pressure with that gauge. Of course, you don't want to start the engine with that gauge on, because if you do, your gauge is now junk, and it's probably going to start leaking fuel out of the back of it. So you got to be careful and keep in mind what gauges you're using. But just those two gauges. And then the third thing is that Orfis fuel line that Cummins recommends, that's got a 43 thousandths Orfis in it, and that's to dump fuel, and that's to make the system work hard. So that way you can check your gear pump to make sure the regulator's not hanging up, and the gear pump's able to make your full pressure at full horsepower, because you're simulating the flow at full horsepower. So that's kind of it. And let's take a quick look now at the parts, and I'll put the links down in below where you can go check out the pieces if you want to buy them and make that kit up. Here's a basic kit that I would put together minus the air equip lines or the whip lines. And on the left there is the Orfis line that Cummins makes. And it's just a dump line with a 43 thousandths Orfis in it. So if you could find a 43 thousandths Orfis and put it in a fitting, you could just buy a coupler and use a piece of clear hose and make your own up. Or you can buy this one. Next, we've got the 0 to minus 30 and then 0 to plus 60 combination gauge. And then we've got the 0 to 400 gauge. This one shows it's liquid filled. It doesn't need to be. Up on the top right, this is the fitting that snaps onto the fittings that Cummins puts in the engine by the fuel filter. The bottom right is just an example of, you might have to make a custom fitting to check your fuel restriction, because the fuel filters on the suction side are so different. This is a 2022 engine in a chassis, and right on the bottom here is the fuel filter. And as you can see, there's no real place to check restriction. There's already an electronic restriction sensor in there, but you might have to buy a special adapter to plug something in to measure your vacuum in your fuel system. And then here is the last example, and this is about 2012 to 2019, and you can see it's got a fitting built right in the top of it for check and restriction, and that's real nice. As the stuff gets newer, it gets less and less user-friendly to break into to check things. So this is a representation of the quick check fitting and the gauge with the whip hose on it. The green line represents a whip hose. I would make up a whip hose for each gauge with the quick check, because when you pop the quick check off, it doesn't leak. So you can put it away, you're not going to have a problem. If you've got, say, 350 psi in the high pressure gauge, if you shut the engine off, that'll bleed down to 0, so you don't have to have the gauge, full of pressure. So you can get away with it that way. If you want to get fancy, you could put a little brass T on there with a drain cock, so you could drain the fuel out of it when you're done, or let the vacuum out when you're done. The sky's the limit, whatever you like. I would recommend one hose dedicated for each one of the tools, and then that orifice hose so that you can make the engine simulate full horsepower. It'll make the gear pump have to work a little harder. And that's the basic kit that you need for the ISX. I'll do another video for the mid-range, because there's just a couple different pieces that you'd need. And I wanted to keep it simple, because some guys only have an ISX. They don't need to know the mid-range stuff. If you work on both, then you can, go back and forth to both. When you're talking about adding more tools than this, then you're getting into where you're spending enough money, unless you're a shop and you're going to be doing this all the time. Why spend the money? Personally, I think this would be the ideal fuel pressure kit to carry on the road. You can check pressure on the engine to see if you got a plug filter there, the drop. You can put the orifice line on and see if the gear pump is able to maintain the pressure in the filter. And if it can't, that would be, you would experience low power when you're pulling, but otherwise it would seem to run okay. So you could troubleshoot that. And you can check fuel filter restriction, and that's really important. You might want to look into plumbing in a fitting down by your gear pump. Go back and look at the fuel system checks on the ISX if you want to do total suction side restriction. And on the new engines, you'll see the new fuel filter. They're not very user-friendly on the frame in terms of putting a fitting in somewhere to check restriction. But on the road, I think this would be a good kit. You can build the whole thing for, I would think, under $400, and you'll be good to go. So we'll see you next time on Engine Shop Joe. Thanks for joining me. I will put the some part numbers down underneath, so take a look down there, and you can check those out and see what they would cost if you wanted to pick them up and build the kit yourself. See you next time on Engine Shop Joe.